From chapter 8, verse 14, and then through to verse 30, and we're going to be focusing on this seemingly simple section from verse 27, but to start reading at verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we've no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand, led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored. He saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, don't go into the village. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, who do people say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Christ. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. There are some things that are completely normal, everyday things, until you think about them. So I'll give you 3 examples. Balloons. It's your birthday. So we're going to hang rubber bags of breath all around the room. Eyebrows. You've got all this hair and then just avoid a gap. And then 2 little strips, and sometimes I've only got 1 strip, and Sarah chases me around the house with tweezers. Honey. In your cupboards, you've got pots of bee vomit that you spread all over your toast. And so you think about that next time your wife says, hey honey. This passage is well known. It's a crucial turning point in Mark's Gospel. After months of watching and learning, a disciple finally grasps who Jesus really is. We've read it, we know it. But in many ways, this passage is a lot stranger than we may have realized. First of all, I want you to see a strange place. When Martin Luther King stood up and said, I have a dream, he stood outside the Lincoln Monument in Washington, D.C. Every year, the president gives his State of the Union address from a beautiful building on Capitol Hill. A great declaration deserves a great setting. You are the Christ. There have never been more important words spoken by a man. But look at where this happened. Verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, who do people say I am? It's strange because of the time. They're in the middle of nowhere. They're not in the town. They're just between villages. They're beside a dusty road where these great words are spoken. The people make this strange. It's a Gentile area. A revelation of Jesus being the Messiah meant nothing to the people in Caesarea Philippi. Think of the authority. This is a Roman town. It's named after Caesar Augustus. Nobody here is seeking a king. And then the religion of the place. Caesarea was the legendary birthplace of the god Pan, god of fields and flocks and nature. Caesarea was a centre for pagan worship. And so it's not in the temple or a Jerusalem palace that Jesus is confessed as Lord, but in the pagan Gentile backwaters of Palestine. And you see it's strange because it's a strange question. Who do people say I am? A man went to interview at Hewlett-Packard and he prepared himself thoroughly for the questions that might be asked. The interview was going well, and then the interviewer said, if Germans were the tallest people in the world, how would you prove it? Jesus asks a simple question. Who do people say I am? He's not asking what do people say I do. He's not asking what do people say I am. It's not about his work, but about his being. Not his actions, but his identity. Who is he? Now, amazingly, that's the question that's on everyone's lips. That's what people are asking each other. Have you heard what Jesus said to the Pharisees? Did you hear about what happened when he met the madman in Gerasa? Have you read the news that the synagogue ruler's daughter is alive, even though she died? Who do you think this Jesus is? Even the disciples were asking that. The storm died down. The sea calmed. The wind stopped. And gobsmacked in a boat, they look at each other and say, who is this man? Well, now Jesus is asking for an answer. That's been the question all the way through Mark's Gospel to this point. Now Jesus wants an answer. What do people think? Who do they say I am? He's not asking for information. He's asking for confession. It's not just about knowledge, but belief. Thirdly, you see this as a strange man. Christopher Columbus divides historians into two camps. There are those who think he's a great hero of many dangerous voyages, and then others say he's a villain who never found what he was looking for and butchered natives. But nobody divides people like Jesus. You can't put him in one category. When one man said he's a crazy man, another one would say, well, does a crazy man speak like that? Could a crazy man preach the Sermon on the Mount? When one said he's demon-possessed, another replied, well, who ever heard of a demon healing people, opening the eyes of the blind? His neighbours knew him as the carpenter's son. His enemies called him sinner's friend. His family thought he was mentally disturbed. And many saw him as a warrior king. But Jesus fits none of these categories. He breaks every mold. He didn't come to bring peace. He didn't come to fit and be shaped into whatever men wanted him to be, but he came to bring a sword dividing families. That's what he said. Fathers had different ideas about who he was from their sons. Sisters who made it a point of agreeing on everything suddenly found they were at odds with each other about who Jesus was. There were three main ideas that the disciples had heard as they travelled Galilee. Verse 28. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others one of the prophets. John the Baptist was King Herod's idea. And we saw that in chapter 6. A lot of his followers would have agreed with him. Jesus didn't fit that mould. John had never done miracles. John had pointed out Jesus as the one who surpassed him, who was before him. And some said Elijah or one of the other prophets. They understand that he's something to do with God. That he speaks for God, but nobody really grasps who Jesus is. Everybody has an idea, but nobody is right. And fourthly, you see it's a strange confession. But what about you? He asks. Who do you say I am? Peter replied, you are the Christ. Not strange because nobody else was saying that. For all they've seen and all they've heard, nobody's clicked that Jesus is any more than a prophet, but something has changed in Peter. And now he sees clearer than ever before. He weighs up all the different things that people are saying. John the Baptist doesn't fit, Elijah doesn't fit, a prophet, it just doesn't fit. None of those options make sense. And so he comes to the only conclusion that's left. You are the Christ. And then it's incredibly strange because of the significance of that sentence. See, if I say to you that John Olomu is the greatest rugby player who ever lived, you might agree, you might disagree, but it's not going to change either of our lives. Peter can't make this confession without life changing forever. Peter is a Jew. And he knows that one day God will send his Messiah. That he will be a great king, but also a suffering servant who will die to save his people. Every Passover, he sat with his father Jonah and his brother Andrew and the rest of the family, and they've rehearsed the Exodus together and look forward to a greater Exodus when Messiah, not Moses, will lead God's people out of captivity. When God's own Son would be the sacrificial lamb that they've just recreated. He would be the one who would take the punishment that Peter's sin deserved. The Messiah would crush Satan's head and free God's people from sin. It'll be a glorious time when David's greater son will sit on David's throne as the mighty God, the everlasting Father and the Prince of Peace. That's what Peter and every Jew are longing for. And so when Peter says, "You, Jesus," that's you. You are the Christ. And that word Christ is the Greek form of the word Messiah. He knows that things are never going to be the same again. Jesus is not just a rabbi anymore that he can walk away from. But he's acknowledging that Jesus deserves his total loyalty as Master, Lord, and God. For Peter, things are never going to be the same again. That's how serious this question is. That's why Jesus stops his disciples on the road and asks them, "What are people saying? And more importantly, who do you say I am?" Everything hangs on the answer to that question. And as you and I read this text, we should feel that Jesus is turning to each one of us individually and asking the question, "What about you? Who do you say I am?" It's not a rhetorical question. What's your answer? It's not a question you can shrug off either. It's too important for you to just dismiss. You can't say, "I don't talk about this religion kind of stuff." Well, why not? You've got opinions about sport and music that have no eternal consequence. You can chat away about weather and the milk price and what you've got for lunch. But you've got nothing to say about Jesus. He claims to be your creator and God. He says that one day you're going to stand before him. And the decision about where you'll spend forever is going to come from his mouth. And he says your response to him now affects eternity forever. And you've got nothing to say? How foolish to be unprepared to meet God because you spent your life talking about tractors, tries, and trout rather than Christ. Every one of us needs to take this question seriously. Who do you say Jesus is? What do you make of him? When you compare him to everybody else who has ever been and is right now, do you see him as totally unique? When you compare him to yourself, when you look at yourself in light of who Jesus is as the standard for heaven that you see, you're just not good enough. And me too, I'm a sinner. And I need his help. See, Peter saw his need of Jesus. And it wasn't because he had a bigger brain or a better heart. But Matthew tells us Jesus told him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood." You didn't get there with your brain and your heart, but it was revealed to you by my Father in heaven. You see, every one of us needs help from God to see. We're like the blind man in verse 22. And until God opens our eyes, until the Holy Spirit invades our heart, we have no hope of being saved. It takes a miracle, a work of God to rescue anyone from hell. Why? Well, firstly, because our hearts are a strange place. Jeremiah 17:9 says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Our hearts are at war with God. There's a wickedness in us that hates everything that God is. The king of your heart isn't Jesus, but it's you. I rule my life. And the gods that I worship, well, they're money and popularity and power. We're desperately sick with sin. And we're so blind to it, we think that we're healthy. What hope is there for us? Peter confessed Christ in an incredibly unlikely place, but there's no more unlikely place to hear Jesus is Lord than in your heart. Secondly, we face a strange question about a strange man. Who is Jesus? After everything you've heard over the last 66 weeks of sermons in Mark's Gospel, who is he? Having weighed the evidence, having looked at everything Mark has laid out before you, who do you say this Jesus is? On what side of his dividing sword do you come down? Which camp are you in? Have you read these words? Have you thought about them seriously? And come to the conclusion that Jesus is a lunatic who claimed he was God, or that he was a liar who deceived countless people, or is he Lord? You must decide. So the knowledge that you have makes him impossible to ignore. If a child says to an air stewardess, I've got a gun in the middle of a flight, it doesn't matter how unlikely that seems. She's got to take that claim seriously, and she will. And so as Jesus intrudes on your nice little life this morning, and he says, I'm the only hope that you have of escaping hell, you've got to respond. You can't take that claim lightly. You can't afford to ignore him. You're a prisoner now to the claims of Jesus Christ. Thirdly, we make a strange confession. Jesus is Lord. You are the Christ. It's strange because no one else is saying it. You look to the world for what to do. You won't find people saying this. People are still trying to fit Jesus into molds that he doesn't fit. A myth. A political leader. A great first century rabbi. And nothing more than that. It doesn't work. People will believe anything but the truth that Mark is showing us. And secondly, it's a strange confession because of its significance. You say these words, you believe them in your heart, life will never be the same again. You see, by believing and confessing Jesus is Lord, you're admitting that you're not good enough for heaven by yourself. You're saying, I need help that's outside of myself. I don't meet the standard that God has set for heaven, but Jesus does. And so you're confessing your need of his righteous life and his death in place of your own. I'm saying I can't take the punishment for my sin. I can't bear the thought of eternity in hell. So I'm going to have to cling to the one who's been there and come back. The one who died but who's now alive forevermore. But how can I do that, Geoff? How can I do that? Because you've told us this morning, and I was listening, it's only those that God reveals Jesus to that can confess him as Lord. I'm not ashamed of the words of Jesus. He says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them. So have you asked God to draw you? See, if you really believe that, if you said, I'm stuck, I can't do it because I'm lost without God's help, well then you would be pleading with God to help you. So have you asked him, have you said, God, in your mercy, draw me to Christ? You see, the one thing that is stopping you from going to heaven is not God's grace, it is you. It's that you won't have heaven's King. And yet still he went to the cross for you. And as Mary read this morning, it was while we were still sin that Christ died for us. He still stands this morning, offering you forgiveness for all your sin. He's here, speaking to you, willing and able to save you from hell. God promises every one of you this morning, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it's with your mouth you confess. It's with your heart you believe and are justified, and it's with your mouth you confess and are saved. For as Scripture says, anyone who believes in him will never be put to shame. Peter's life changed forever. Did he regret it? No. Did his Messiah ever let him down? Never. He lived for Jesus. He died for Jesus. And one day he will reign with Jesus. And so will the poorest, weakest Christian here. There's one last strange thing in this passage in verse 30. It's a strange command. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. People were still confused about who Jesus was. There's all these different ideas. There are still those looking to make him king by force. It wasn't time to share this news. The resurrection and Pentecost had not yet come. Then things would change. Jesus Messiah makes no strange command to you today, Christian. He says, you know me. And you know what I'm about. You know what I'm doing in this world. So go. Go to this dark, broken, hurting place. Tell them. Preach the good news to all creation. Win them by your words and action. Jesus is Lord. And we sit back and think, oh, it's just too hard, isn't it? Who's the hardest person to reach? Who's the hardest person to reach in town? How about a 19-year-old boy? It's pretty tough. How about a 19-year-old shearer? It's pretty tough. How about a 19-year-old shearer with no previous experience of being in church, of hearing the gospel, of knowing who Jesus is? Surely that's beyond the grasp of God's saving arm. And yet I could sit on Thursday with Keanu and hear him say, Jesus is Lord. He's my Saviour. Not just in my head. I don't just understand that these things are true, but it's my Saviour. There's no excuse for any of us not to have absolute confidence in God's ability to work this incredible miracle of salvation in any life. We pray and we work.